The most controlled man on television confessed his life's greatest failure across 1,200 miles, pouring out a lifetime of apologies to a silent hospital room. When his mother Ruth finally responded, her 6-word verdict shattered his famous composure and changed the entire course of his retirement. Johnny Carson was the master of late-night television. Picture the black suit, the perfect tie, the monologue that was a flawless dance on the edge of brilliance. He was the king of the one-liner, the ultimate performer whose composure was as famous as his Carson Cool. Millions tuned in every night, believing they knew the man who invited them into their living rooms. On that stage, Johnny Carson was unflappable, the epitome of grace under pressure, creating an unspoken contract of trust and laughter with his viewers. He built a television empire and became a national institution, powerful, charming, yet always maintaining a necessary aura of detachment. But even for a man who commanded such widespread adoration, there existed a singular, deeply personal longing. His deepest desire was far more fundamental than fame or accolades. It was the yearning for a heartfelt, unqualified, well-done son from his mother, Ruth Carson. Her approval, though rarely voiced, was the silent force that drove him, the invisible current beneath the glittering surface of his success. Every laugh he elicited felt incomplete without her affirmation. The world saw Johnny Carson, the confident showman, but Johnny saw himself through the eyes of a woman who, no matter how bright his star shone, always seemed to find a shadow. Ruth Carson, a product of the stoic Nebraska prairie, valued a balanced checkbook and quiet stability far more than the glittering indulgence of Hollywood fame. Her emotions were reserved, and her love was expressed not through praise but through a constant, quiet critique. This chasm between Burbank's high-gloss celebrity and Norfolk, Nebraska's reserved landscape, defined the impossible distance between mother and son. Her discerning gaze created an insatiable hunger in young Johnny. He didn't just want to be funny, he wanted to be so undeniably good that even she couldn't withhold her admiration. That need to be absolutely flawless became the core of his professional genius. The king of late night was, in private, just a little boy trying to make his mama smile. The irony was heartbreaking. His success became the wall between them. The more famous he got, the more complex and tense their conversations became. When Johnny tried to call home, those interactions were never easy, free-flowing chats. They were careful, brief performances. Ruth would politely ask about the weather or a minor plumbing issue, always deflecting any genuine emotional inquiry. She never watched his show live. She was always in bed by 10 o'clock. If he mentioned a difficult interview, she'd respond with a practical, minimizing remark. Well, that's what they pay. You for dear. The applause of 20 million people meant nothing compared to the weight of that one missing affirmation. He was loved by an entire nation, but he lived with the gnawing certainty that he hadn't quite earned the respect of the one person who mattered most. This personal failure was the secret Johnny carried in his silent, empty dressing room every night after the curtain dropped. It created the armor he wore on stage, the legendary Carson Cool, because if he couldn't get validation from her, he would prove his worth to the world. He was searching for the exact combination of words that would finally melt the Midwest Reserve and make her truly acknowledge what he had accomplished. He would spend his career trying to bridge that profound, emotional separation, not knowing that the final, difficult conversation was rapidly approaching, and that her true feelings were about to be revealed in a way that would rewrite his entire history. The call always began exactly the same way, as ritualized as his monologue's opening joke. A careful exchange of pleasantries, a brief query about the California sunshine versus the Nebraska snow, and a quick, nervous intake of breath on Johnny's end. He was the most relaxed man in America for an hour every night, yet on the phone with his mother, he became a rigid, anxious boy again. This was the last time, though, that they would speak under the guise of normalcy. It was early May of 1992. The world was already awash in tributes, specials, and retrospective interviews, anticipating Johnny's retirement from The Tonight Show. He had made the announcement months earlier, and the buildup was colossal, a cultural farewell on an epic scale. Hollywood was throwing him parties, presidents were sending telegrams, the public was treating him like royalty, stepping down from the throne. But to Ruth, the retirement was simply a fact, another life choice delivered across the phone lines. Johnny made the call from his private office at National Broadcasting Company, the luxurious space silent and insulated, overlooking the vast, clamorous city. He tried to inject a note of genuine excitement into his voice, hoping to finally share the joy and the relief that came with ending a 30-year marathon. "Well, Mom," he began, leaning back, trying to sound casual, "the big day's coming up next week. I'm done, finished, time to relax." Silence stretched across the phone line, traveling the 1,200 miles of static and unresolved history. Then Ruth's voice, sharp and clear, cut through the quiet. It wasn't praise, it wasn't a congratulation, it was classic Ruth. "Well," she said slowly, "it's about time. It always seemed awfully late for a body to be working. You'll be able to get to bed at a decent hour now, won't you?" The simple, practical words, "it's about time," hit him like a physical blow, deflating all his anticipation. She wasn't acknowledging his legacy, she was criticizing his schedule. The very success he had leveraged to move her out of her old house, the career that had earned him legendary status, she viewed as nothing more than an unhealthy late-night shift. He swallowed his disappointment, the familiar sting of needing and failing to gain her approval washing over him. He tried to pivot, talking about the farm she grew up on, hoping to find a shared, neutral memory, but the conversation stalled again. It always felt like a transaction, not a connection. He would speak, and she would simply process the information, withholding the emotional validation he desperately sought. The truth was, she had spent her life guarding against the excesses and perceived risks of show business, and now, even in retirement, she couldn't let down that wall. He ended the call quickly, inventing an urgent production meeting to escape the suffocating quiet on the other end. "I've got to go, Mom. I'll call you after the final broadcast." He hung up the phone, the silence of his office once again overwhelming, leaving him to nurse the familiar wound. He felt the sting of her disappointment, not realizing that this was the very last moment in his life he would hang up the phone, believing he still had time to fix things, still had time to hear the words he truly longed for. The clock was ticking, not just on his career, but on the possibility of genuine connection. Johnny stepped out of the National Broadcasting Company building into the California sunshine, yet an undeniable chill settled over him. The king had abdicated, but the quiet judgment of his mother's 3 words, "It's about time," echoed louder than the applause. He was haunted by the silence, by the years of suppressed guilt over the relationship he always meant to fix but never did. He realized his whole life had been one long postponement. He always told himself he'd call after this season or visit once the ratings stabilized. The show, the grueling schedule, was his grand excuse, but the painful truth was that his fame allowed him to avoid the emotionally naked conversations he was never equipped to have. He remembered a small, significant instance from the 1970s. Ruth mentioned a loose floorboard. Johnny, wealthy beyond measure, arranged a full kitchen renovation. When he called her, she thanked him politely. "That new wallpaper's a lot of fuss. I just needed the floorboard mended." He had tried to buy her approval with spectacle, but she only ever wanted simplicity. The regret over these missed connections became a crushing weight in the weeks immediately following his retirement. He was adrift, planning to take a trip home, but final episode obligations kept him tethered to the coast for weeks. He was trapped by the very fame he was trying to escape. He found himself paralyzed, wanting to call her but terrified of her familiar, cool distance. He walked toward the sleek, black telephone in his study, but the weight of the handset felt immense, a physical manifestation of the 1,200 miles separating them. His fingers trembled, yet he couldn't push them down. The fear of her polite deflection was more potent than the urgency of his need. The phone, the symbol of connection, had become a heavy, silent weapon of avoidance. The silence stretched for 3 weeks, the longest gap they had ever shared without speaking. He knew, deep down, he was justifying a fear of rejection, postponing intimacy in favor of control. The opportunity to call arrived on a quiet Friday afternoon. He walked toward the phone, ready to risk the emotional confrontation. But then the phone rang, shattering the silent tension. It wasn't Ruth. It was his private secretary, calling from Omaha, Nebraska, and the first word out of his mouth immediately made the polished floor drop out beneath Johnny's feet. The guilt was a terrible, consuming thing, Yet what happened next would ensure Johnny never had the chance to utter the apology he had spent 3 decades rehearsing. The sound of the telephone ringing that Friday afternoon was not a cheerful chime, it was an alarm, shattering the fragile quiet of Johnny's retirement. It cut through the silence of his magnificent Malibu home like a knife, delivering a verdict he had spent 3 decades trying to outrun. The moment his secretary, speaking from the familiar, frozen geography of Omaha, uttered the first word, Johnny knew his life of professional postponement had just exacted its cruelest toll. "Mr. Carson, it's Dick. He's calling from the hospital." The formality of the title, Mr. Carson, felt absurdly misplaced in that moment of raw panic. His younger brother, Dick, was rarely dramatic, and the tightness in his voice immediately communicated a profound emergency. Johnny snatched the phone. "Dick, what is it? What happened?" The smooth, controlled voice of the former television host was gone, replaced by a rough, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated fear. The news was swift and brutal. Ruth had suffered a major physiological event, a rapid, sudden decline. She had been at home, alone, and was now in the intensive care unit. The doctors were clear. The end was imminent. Days, perhaps hours. "She's fading, John," Dick said, his voice cracking with exhaustion and grief. "They don't expect her to rally. You need to come home. Now." Johnny was paralyzed. He stood in the California sun, his world tilting, unable to process the finality of the diagnosis. All the carefully constructed walls of his life, the celebrity, the wealth, the impeccable control, crumbled instantly. He had spent his entire career convincing the world he was unflappable. But here, facing the ultimate truth of his mother's failing health, he was reduced to a frightened, hesitant boy. The guilt was the first thing to hit him, an overwhelming, crushing wave. He hadn't called. He had postponed the difficult conversation, rationalizing the delay with the trivialities of his final farewell tour. He had wasted 3 precious weeks, sacrificing the last possible moments of connection for the sake of avoiding emotional awkwardness. The memory of her last, cool words, "It's about time," now echoed with the chilling finality of a prophecy. He stumbled to his chair, the luxury surrounding him suddenly feeling hollow and vulgar. All the fame, all the power couldn't buy him one more hour. He had the fastest planes, the most resources, but time itself was now the one thing he couldn't negotiate. He wanted to scream, to lash out at the universe for this cruel timing, but all that escaped was a quiet, desolate whisper. "I didn't call. I didn't say goodbye." He booked the flight immediately, but the 550-word apology he had planned to deliver in person, the grand confession of his lifelong need for her love, now felt hopelessly inadequate. The task was no longer about seeking approval. It was about confronting the possibility of having left her with the permanent impression of a son who loved his work more than his family. He had to face his mother, knowing he might arrive too late, bearing the weight of years of silent, unspoken love and regret. The plane would take him to Nebraska quickly, but the journey he was beginning, the agonizing race against the clock to repair a lifetime of emotional distance, was only just starting. The roar of the private jet's engines was a hollow sound against the frantic hammering inside Johnny's chest. He was suspended 12,000 feet above the continent, strapped into a plush leather seat, the epitome of worldly success. Yet he felt utterly powerless, watching the clock tick down toward an unchangeable finality. He was racing against the fastest clock in the world, the one counting his mother's remaining breaths. Every mile that passed beneath the wings was measured not by distance, but by years of regret. He closed his eyes, the memory of her last cool phone call stinging him anew. Why hadn't he forced the conversation? Why had he always retreated behind the comfort of his fame, letting his performance persona dictate his private life? The truth was ugly. He was afraid of her truth. He was terrified that if he reached out, she would confirm his deepest fear, that he had chosen the bright lights over the small, quiet dignity of being a simple son. He remembered a small, chipped ceramic doll she kept on her mantelpiece back in Norfolk. It wasn't worth anything, but it was a childhood treasure of hers. He had once suggested, during one of their stilted holiday calls, replacing it with a priceless antique from a Beverly Hills gallery. Ruth had simply replied, "Why would I do that, John? That one is mine." He realized then, mid-flight, the brutal clarity of his lifelong mistake. He had always tried to give her the world's measure of success, when all she ever valued was what they already possessed, simple and unadorned. The hours stretched, each one an eternity of self-recrimination. He paced the cabin, the rich carpet feeling alien beneath his feet. Then the plane hit a sudden, vicious pocket of turbulence. Not a gentle bump, but a violent, stomach-dropping lurch that sent the aircraft shaking. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, calm but strained, advising they were hitting unexpected weather and would have to hold at a higher altitude for an unforgivable 20 minutes. 20 minutes. It felt like a lifetime stolen by the indifferent forces of nature. The delay shattered Johnny's composure. He grabbed the satellite phone again and desperately dialed Dick at the hospital, demanding to know the exact status. Dick confirmed the grim prognosis hadn't changed, but Johnny pressed him. "Just put the phone down near her, Dick. I need to hear something, anything." For a moment, Dick hesitated, then complied. Johnny pressed the phone to his ear, and through the frantic static of the high-altitude connection, he could hear the faint, hollow ping of the life support machines and the shallow, labored rhythm of his mother's breathing. It was the sound of a countdown clock, the most terrifying sound the king of late night had ever heard. The unbridgeable physical gap had been bridged by technology, but the emotional gap remained vast and terrifying. The plane began its descent over the flat, unforgiving plains of Nebraska. Below, the landscape was muted and familiar, the true color of his soul. As the plane touched down, skidding slightly on the Omaha runway, Johnny felt a profound sense of doom. He grabbed his coat, ignoring the pilot's final briefing. He knew he had precious little time left, and the apology he had practiced for 30 years was still hopelessly trapped in his throat. He had finally arrived home, but the silence he feared most, the silence of permanent separation, was waiting for him, and he didn't know if he was brave enough to face it. The sterile scent of the hospital was nothing like the perfume of backstage flowers or the smoky air of Studio One. It was the raw, unforgiving smell of finality, and it instantly stripped the king of late night of all his armor. He followed the quiet nurse down the brightly lit corridor, his famous name affording him no special privilege here, where the only audience was lost. Every step was heavy, leading him toward the most important and terrifying performance of his life. He pushed open the door to room 312. It was a small, quiet space, dominated by the rhythmic ping and whoosh of monitors, the mechanical substitutes for the life force that was slipping away. And there she was, Ruth Carson, the formidable woman who had defined his ambition, now impossibly frail and still beneath the white sheets. She was an anchor woman to his past, and now she was fading out, leaving him adrift. Johnny stood in the doorway, unable to move. This was the woman who had watched him practice magic tricks in the Nebraska kitchen, the one whose tough love had fueled his flight to stardom. Now her face was pale, lined with the effort of breathing, her eyes closed. The sight of her profound vulnerability paralyzed him far more effectively than any bad joke or hostile guest ever could. He was the master of the extemporaneous, yet here, in the presence of his deepest emotional need, he was mute. He looked at her, realizing that the commanding voice that had filled 20 million living rooms every night was utterly useless here. The only words that mattered were trapped, locked behind the decades of emotional reserve he had perfected. Dick and his sister Kathleen were sitting quietly near the window, their faces etched with weary grief. They nodded silently to Johnny, understanding that this was a moment beyond words, beyond family pleasantries. This was about the complex, private knot between a mother and her most famous, most emotionally distant son. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Johnny crossed the room. He didn't approach the sterile machines, he approached the woman. He gently pulled up a chair and reached for her hand. His hand, the one that had held a microphone and waved to millions, was large and warm. Hers was thin, cool, and frighteningly still. He held it, a simple act of physical connection that they had seldom shared in his adult life. He just sat there, allowing the rhythm of the machines to fill the silence, attempting to communicate 30 years of unsaid affection through the pressure of his grip. He tried to speak. He tried to tell her he was sorry for the distance, sorry for the fame that became a wall, sorry for not calling sooner. But the words caught, trapped in his throat by a sudden, intense flood of emotion. Johnny Carson, who was effortlessly eloquent in front of the world, could not manage a single, coherent sentence for his mother. All his polished charm, his genius for conversation, was useless. He just held her hand, tears stinging his eyes, finally realizing that the thing he feared most was not the loss of his career, but the loss of this chance to connect. He leaned close, his mouth just inches from her ear, and whispered her name. "Mom, Ruth." Her eyelids fluttered, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but it was enough. It was a faint sign that she knew he was there. And in that moment, Johnny began to shed the celebrity skin and become just a son, ready to try and repair a lifetime of emotional fracture, knowing that the only language left to them was the truth. He knew he had to speak, and he knew he had to discard the jokes and the posturing entirely. The moment was upon him, and he had to risk everything he was to finally reach her. The tiny movement of her eyelids, that faint acknowledgement of his presence, was the cue Johnny had waited for his entire life. It was his final opportunity to trade the script of the king of late night for the desperate, unpolished truth of the sun. He leaned down, placing his cheek against hers for a moment, a touch of profound intimacy, and then began to speak, his voice rough with tears, softer than it had ever been on camera. He didn't talk about ratings or guests. He went straight back to Norfolk, back to the source of his endless ambition. "Mom," he whispered, his voice catching, "I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for the distance. I'm sorry I let the show become a wall between us. I always told myself I was too busy, but the truth is, I was afraid." He paused, steadying himself. "I was afraid of you, Mom. Afraid I wasn't good enough. Every joke, every standing ovation, every single minute of those 30 years, it wasn't about the audience, Ruth. It was about you." He confessed, pouring out the secret he had guarded behind his famous smile for decades. "I did it for you. I was trying so hard to be so undeniably successful that you couldn't help but be proud. I thought if I reached the top of the world, you would finally say, 'That's my John, and he did good.' I thought I could buy your approval with fame, but all I bought was distance." He gently squeezed her hand, which remained cool and still in his. "I love you, Mom. I should have just said it, but I always expected you to say it first, and I waited too long. Please forgive me for wasting our time." The room was utterly silent, save for the quiet whoosh of her oxygen machine. Johnny watched her chest rise and fall, a fragile rhythm against the inevitable. He felt the catharsis of having finally spoken the truth, but it was a lonely release. She hadn't responded. He wondered if she had even heard him. He began to talk about a simpler time, about his first magic kit, about the time he made the neighbor's egg disappear. And she laughed, truly laughed, one of the few pure, unconditional laughs he could recall from his childhood. He spoke about his first television appearance, not the big national one, but the tiny local broadcast in Omaha, when he was just a skinny kid with a borrowed suit and a shaky microphone. He finished his desperate monologue, his head bent, exhausted by the emotional expenditure. The silence returned, heavy and final. He felt the familiar despair rising, the terrible certainty that he had come all this way, confessed everything, and still failed to reach her. His confession was destined to go unanswered. He looked up, his eyes meeting his brother's, which were filled with sorrow and understanding. Just as he prepared to accept the quiet failure, something miraculous occurred. It was not a grand gesture, but a small sign. Ruth's eyes remained closed, but the fingers in Johnny's hand, the cool, still fingers, flexed, a tiny, determined movement against his palm. Then, with a profound effort that seemed to drain the last of her strength, her lips parted slightly and she began to whisper. The whisper was fragile, a ghostly sound that barely reached his ear. But Johnny leaned in, desperate to catch the essence of the final, defining truth he had chased his whole life. The world contracted, too. The single point of sound emanating from Ruth Carson's lips, all the studio lights, the applause, the fame, it vanished. Only the faint, shallow whisper remained, a fragile thread of sound that held the weight of 86 years of unspoken affection and expectation. Johnny leaned closer, his ear hovering inches from her mouth, terrified of missing the single, defining truth he had spent his life pursuing. He heard the first syllable, a rough, hesitant breath, and then the words formed, startlingly clear despite their weakness, delivered with a final, magnificent surge of maternal strength. She whispered, "My funny boy, you came home." 6 simple words, not an apology for her lifelong criticism, not an affirmation of his genius, and not the "I love you" he had waited decades to hear. Yet they explained everything. Johnny straightened slightly, the immense shock turning quickly to devastating, heart-wrenching comprehension. He had always seen her criticism as disapproval of his chosen path, proof that he wasn't stable enough, not serious enough. But her last words revealed the truth. She had never stopped seeing him as her funny boy, the playful, clever kid from Nebraska, not the polished, distant king of late night. The critique wasn't a rejection of his talent, it was a desperate, if flawed, attempt to protect the boy she loved from the harshness of the world he was rushing toward. And then, the final, crucial phrase, "You came home." It was the ultimate, unconditional forgiveness for the distance, for the missed calls, for the years of emotional separation. It meant that his frantic race across the country, his raw, unpolished confession had been enough. He was present. He was home. Johnny Carson, the man who never cried on cue, the master of the televised emotion, broke down completely. He buried his head in the sheets beside her, sobbing, not the quiet tears of grief, but the wrenching, soul-deep cry of a man finally released from the prison of his own expectations. The tears were for Ruth, yes, but they were also for the terrified little boy who finally understood that he had been loved all along, just not in the way he expected. The sound was not just a sob, it was a total, absolute breakdown of the legendary Carson Cool. The years of discipline, the armor of wit, the shield of professional distance, it all shattered at once. Johnny physically collapsed against the bed rail, his shoulders shaking uncontrollably, feeling the intense, almost painful rush of the lifelong burden lifting from his soul. This was the moment the public performer became utterly human, released from the endless need to prove his worth. It was the most honest, unscripted moment of his entire existence, a moment of profound, painful, and beautiful catharsis that was worth every single minute of the 3 decades on television. He felt the pressure of her hand relax, the life ebbing out of the fragile grip that held him. He pulled back, his face streaked with tears, and looked at her. A profound peace had settled over her features, the worry lines of 80 years finally smoothing away. He knew, with absolute certainty, that her soul was free, and in her final 6 words, she had given him the very same gift. The heart monitor issued a long, steady tone, and the quiet room suddenly felt vast and silent. Johnny stood there, still holding her hand, knowing he was no longer alone, because the weight of his lifelong regret had just been lifted by the simplest, most powerful 6 words a mother could ever give her son. Ruth Carson was gone, but she had left her son a secret, a 6-word key to his own heart. The world would never know those words, but they would instantly and permanently change the man Johnny Carson was in his retirement, forcing him to live a life built not on applause, but on profound, quiet authenticity. Ruth Carson's passing was private, quiet, and absolutely final, the total opposite of the spectacular life her son had led. But her 6 words, "My funny boy, you came home," were not meant for the public. They were a profound, personal explanation, a final act of maternal grace that defined the rest of Johnny Carson's life. He carried those words like a secret key, understanding at last that his career had not been a rejection of her values, but a fulfillment of his nature. The retirement that followed was not the quiet, restless drifting the press predicted. It was, instead, a profound shift toward authenticity. The need to perform, to seek validation from the crowd, simply evaporated. He had finally received the only review that ever mattered, and it gave him permission to stop running. The legendary Carson Cool remained, but it was now softened by an underlying, genuine warmth, a peace that emanated from the settled score with his past. He became intensely private, not because he was aloof, but because he was finally present in his own life. The vast network of his generous, anonymous philanthropy grew exponentially after his mother was put to rest in the Nebraska soil. He understood now, with a clarity that only grief and love can provide, that true success was measured in small, quiet acts of kindness, not in television ratings. He stopped looking up at the world and started looking around, focusing his immense resources on supporting the same kind of honest, hardworking people his mother represented. He never told anyone where the money came from, upholding the quiet dignity she always prized. The few friends he kept close in retirement noticed the subtle but fundamental change. His laughter was more genuine, his conversations were less guarded. He stopped deflecting questions about his past with jokes and instead began to speak, sparingly and honestly, about the things that truly mattered: childhood memories, the value of simplicity, the importance of showing up for people. He never spoke the 6 words aloud, not even to his closest companions, but the effect of those words became his living testament. In the final years of his life, whenever Johnny was asked about the loneliness of fame or the pressure of his career, he would smile a genuine, relaxed smile and gently change the subject. But sometimes people would catch him, especially when he thought no one was watching, simply staring out at the ocean, vast, beautiful, and utterly indifferent to his celebrity. In those moments, one could almost see him listening to that whisper again. He realized the true brilliance of his mother's 6 words. They didn't just forgive him, they defined him. He wasn't the king of late night, he was her funny boy. And in that simple, true identity, he finally found the validation he had spent his life chasing. The retirement wasn't an ending, it was the ultimate homecoming. The entire career, the glamour, the fame, the jokes, it all led to a hospital room in Nebraska, where a son received his final, most important lesson: that love is not conditional on achievement, but conditional on presence. Johnny Carson, the man who made the world laugh, finally learned how to live quietly, fully, and completely, guided by the profound, unconditional love of his mother's last 6 words. He had finally come home, and the world was left with the beautiful mystery of his peace. This story reminds us that even the biggest stars are just human beings looking for acceptance, and that the quiet moments of connection often matter more than all the applause in the world. If Johnny Carson's final, beautiful lesson about the power of showing up touched your heart, please give this video a like and share. And to ensure you never miss another story about the profound human moments behind Hollywood's biggest legends, be sure to hit that subscribe button.